The betrayal and the beginning. The twin moons of Veros 9 shone softly over the city of Eldoria. The night was calm, but inside a small house near the outskirts, Captain Mira Kane was laughing. She sat across from her husband, Jonas Kane, as he poured them both a drink. "You always burn the food," she teased. Jonas smirked. "I didn't hear you complaining while eating." Mira chuckled and shook her head. It had been a long time since she felt this peace. After years of war, she had finally retired from the military. No more battles. No more blood. Just her and Jonas, living a quiet life. Then, a loud noise came from outside. Mira's instincts sharpened. She placed her glass down and then stood up. Jonas looked at her, confused. "What is it?" he asked. Before she could answer, the front door exploded. A group of masked assassins rushed inside, armed with silenced weapons. Mira reacted fast, grabbing the knife from the table. But there were too many of them. Jonas tried to stand, but a gunshot echoed in the house. The bullet hit him in the chest. He fell backward, his eyes wide with shock. Blood spread across his shirt. "No!" Mira screamed, lunging forward. But a powerful force slammed into her. One of the attackers struck her with an electric baton. Pain shot through her body as she collapsed onto the floor. Through blurry vision, she saw Jonas gasping for air. His fingers twitched, reaching for her. Then, a tall man stepped forward. His voice was calm, almost bored. "She's alive, just like the boss wanted." Another voice spoke, a deep whisper. "Kill the engineer. The message has been sent." Mira struggled, but her muscles wouldn't move. The electric shock had paralyzed her. She could only watch as the assassin aimed his gun at Jonas's head. The last thing she saw was the flash of a muzzle. Then, darkness. A fire inside her. Mira woke up to the smell of burning metal. Her body ached, her head pounded. She felt cold air against her skin. She was lying on the ground, just outside her house. The walls were blackened, fire eating through the remains of her home. She forced herself to move. Her arms were weak, but she pushed through the pain. Then she saw him. Jonas. His body lay in the rubble, his eyes staring at the sky. Lifeless. For a moment, the world stopped. A sharp pain stabbed her chest, not from the electric baton. This was worse. A pain that cut through her soul. She crawled to him, her hands shaking. She touched his face, her fingers brushing against his blood-stained skin. A single thought burned in her mind. They killed him. They left me alive. And they had whispered a name before disappearing. The Obsidian Syndicate, a criminal empire feared across the galaxy. Assassins, smugglers, and warlords, all under one name. But why? Why would they kill Jonas? He was an engineer, not a fighter. Then she noticed something near his body. His hand was gripping a data chip. She took it, her fingers closing tightly around it. Whatever was on this chip, it had to be important. Mira closed her eyes, taking a slow breath. The woman she had been, the woman who wanted a peaceful life, was gone. In her place, something new was rising. Something filled with rage. She had spent years fighting in wars. She had killed before. But now, for the first time, she was going to kill for herself. The Obsidian Syndicate would pay. She would find them. And she would burn their world to the ground. The hunt begins. Mira didn't waste any time. The minute the Raven's Claw left the atmosphere of Veros 9, she set her sights on the nearest space station. Darkreach, a notorious black market hub. It was a place where criminals, smugglers, and mercenaries gathered to do business. It was also a place where information could be bought. And more importantly, where she could track down those responsible for Jonas's death. Her hands gripped the controls tightly, knuckles white, as the ship sliced through the stars. Every thought in her mind was consumed by revenge. The Obsidian Syndicate had to pay for killing Jonas. They had to feel the weight of her grief, her fury. Darkreach loomed ahead, a massive crumbling station that looked like a scrap heap from the outside. But inside, it was a labyrinth of dark alleyways, neon lights, and backroom deals. Mira knew this was where she would find answers. She had visited stations like this during her time in the military, but this time it was personal. She docked her ship and quickly equipped herself with a black armored suit and a long cloak to blend in. Her laser pistol hung at her side, and a blade rested hidden beneath her coat. She didn't trust anyone here, and she didn't care to make friends. She had a mission, and that mission was to find Krell Torin, the enforcer she had learned about from the assassin before he died. Krell was the key to everything. Mira stepped off the ship and walked into the crowded marketplace. The sound of chatter, laughter, and deals being made filled the air. She kept her head down, eyes scanning for anyone who might look suspicious. Her target was somewhere here, and she wasn't leaving until she found him. The encounter with the smuggler. Hours passed, and Mira was no closer to finding Krell Torin. She had questioned a few of the locals, but no one knew much. This place was a labyrinth of lies, and finding the right lead was like searching for a needle in a haystack. Just as she was about to give up and move on, she overheard a conversation between two smugglers near an alley. Heard the Obsidian Syndicate is paying big for information on some woman, one of them was saying. I've seen her before, quiet, but dangerous. She's been asking about Krell Torin. Mira's heart skipped a beat. She moved closer, staying in the shadows. She had to know more. One of them said she was married to someone important. The second smuggler added, his voice low. I don't know all the details, but she's been taking down syndicate operatives across the system. If she finds Krell's dead, the first smuggler interrupted, cutting him off. If she comes looking for him, she's wasting her time. Krell went down on Veros 9. 2 weeks ago. Some bounty hunter got him, probably the same one who took out the Kane woman's husband. Mira's chest tightened. Jonas had died because of Krell Torin, and now it was clear that Krell had paid the price for it. But that didn't solve her problem. She needed to find out who hired Krell, and more importantly, who had ordered Jonas's death. She stepped forward, too fast for the smugglers to react. With a swift motion, she grabbed the second smuggler by the collar and lifted him off the ground. Tell me everything. The smuggler's eyes widened in fear. He stuttered, his voice shaky. I don't know much. Just that Krell was working for someone high up in the syndicate. Some name. I think it was Talos. Lord Talos, something like that. Mira's grip tightened, and the smuggler gasped for air. She didn't have time for lies. Where can I find this Talos? She demanded. The smuggler gulped. I don't know, but you might want to try the Nebula Pit. It's a bar. Lord Talos has a private room there. It's his headquarters. That's all I know, I swear. Without another word, Mira dropped him, watching as the smuggler scrambled away, his legs shaking. Into the Nebula Pit. Mira didn't waste any more time on the station's maze. She headed straight for the Nebula Pit, a dimly lit bar on the lower level of Darkreach. The air inside was thick with smoke and the smell of cheap liquor. A live band played in the corner, and a few shady characters huddled around tables, whispering secrets that no one else should hear. Mira's eyes scanned the room, her hand resting near her pistol. She didn't trust anyone in here. She had learned long ago that in places like this, trust was a luxury she couldn't afford. She made her way to the back of the bar, where a pair of heavily armed guards stood. They didn't say anything as she approached. They didn't need to. Mira knew she wasn't here for small talk. She was here for answers. The guards exchanged a quick glance, and one of them spoke. You don't look like one of Talos's usual guests. Mira's voice was cold, deadly. I'm not here to make friends. The second guard stepped forward, his hand on the hilt of a large knife. I'm afraid you're not getting in then. Without hesitation, Mira drew her blade and took a single step forward. The first guard reached for his gun, But Mira was faster. She moved in a blur, her sword flashing through the air as she disarmed him. In the same movement, she knocked the second guard to the floor with a kick. Both men were incapacitated in moments, and Mira was through the door before anyone could stop her. The confrontation with Talos's men. Behind the door was a long hallway, dimly lit and lined with more security. Lord Talos's personal quarters were at the end. Mira knew she was close. But the closer she got to the room, the more guards she had to deal with. This wasn't just about finding information anymore. It was a full-out fight for her life. In the final hallway, Mira ran into a wall of men, all wearing the same black armor, the mark of the Syndicate. They had guns, blades, and cybernetic enhancements, and they were ready to die for Lord Talos. Mira didn't hesitate. She charged forward, her sword flashing, as she cut through them with precision. One man lunged at her with a pulse rifle, but she kicked it from his hands and slashed his throat before he could make a sound. She was moving like a storm, unstoppable and fierce. Every cut, every strike, was pure vengeance for Jonas. As the last guard fell, Mira stood in the silence, her chest heaving. She wasn't done yet. She pushed open the door to Talos's personal quarters. A deal with the devil. Mira had crossed into dangerous territory. Her mission was no longer a simple revenge for the death of her husband. No, it had evolved into something much darker. The Nebula Pit was a minor taste of the bloodshed and chaos that would follow. But Mira knew that to go after Lord Talos, the leader of the Obsidian Syndicate, she needed more than just strength and speed. She needed power, the kind of power that could break entire systems. And there was only one person in the galaxy who could provide that, Admiral Vex Orlin. The name sent chills through anyone who had ever heard it. Vex Orlin was not a man you crossed unless you had a death wish. He was a warlord, a former fleet commander who had turned rogue and built his own empire of mercenaries, spies, and black market traders. He had once fought alongside Mira in the war against the Tyrannian Empire, but that was long before the galaxy had fallen into chaos. After the war ended, Orlin turned against everyone. He betrayed alliances, burned bridges, and carved a path of destruction across the galaxy. Now he was one of the most feared figures in the known universe. But Mira had no choice. She needed his help. She needed his army. And in exchange for it, she would give him what he wanted most, the head of Lord Talos. The deal with a monster. Mira's journey took her to the edge of the galaxy, to a desolate moon on the outskirts of Noxeri space, known only as Fortress Row 7. It was a massive military compound, heavily fortified, and hidden from prying eyes. Inside, the walls were lined with armored guards, elite soldiers who had sworn loyalty only to Admiral Orlin. As Mira's ship landed, a grim sense of dread filled her chest. She had walked into the lair of a monster. Orlin was no fool. He knew she was coming. He always knew. She stepped off her ship, her boots hitting the cold ground, and immediately felt the weight of Orlin's presence. It was like the entire moon was holding its breath, waiting for her to make the first move. Inside the fortress, Mira was led through a maze of halls and into an elevated chamber. The room was dim, lit only by the glow of strange, alien technology that hummed softly in the background. At the far end of the room stood Admiral Vex Orlin. He was tall, with a broad frame, his eyes hidden behind a pair of dark sunglasses that never left his face. His armor, dark and sleek, was scarred from battles long past. His hands rested on the table before him, fingers twitching with the promise of danger. Mira stood tall, refusing to show any sign of fear. "I'm here for one reason, Orlin. Help me take down Lord Talos and his syndicate, and I'll help you crush your enemies." Orlin didn't speak immediately. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping rhythmically on the cold metal surface in front of him. The silence stretched on, thick and heavy, until Orlin finally spoke, his voice low and calm. "You think you can take down Lord Talos?" he asked, his tone mocking. The Obsidian Syndicate controls more than you realize. They're untouchable, girl. The Syndicate has connections, resources. You're a pawn, and you're not even on the board yet. Mira's jaw tightened. She wasn't here to argue with him. She was here for his army, his ships, his firepower. I've been hunting the Syndicate for months. I've killed their men. I've destroyed their outposts. I don't need a lecture from you, Orlin. I need your help. If you think the Syndicate is untouchable, then you don't know me. Orlin's lips curled into a smile, but there was nothing friendly in it. You're brave, but bravery doesn't win wars. Power does. He stood up, walking toward her slowly, his steps deliberate. I'll give you a taste of the power you're asking for, but in return, you'll owe me something. Mira narrowed her eyes. She had heard the rumors about Orlin's deals. He was no fool. He didn't give anything for free. What do you want? He paused, and when he spoke, his voice was smooth as silk, but laced with a venomous edge. I want you to kill someone for me. A man named Jurek Vol, an old rival of mine. He's hiding in the Gorgona Nebula, a perfect place for him to slip through my grasp. Orlin's gaze locked onto Mira's, intense and unyielding. Once you bring me his head, I'll give you everything you need to take down the Syndicate. Mira clenched her fists. She knew what she was walking into. Killing Vos wasn't going to be easy. He was a former military officer, a man with a vast network of supporters and a legion of mercenaries at his command. But she had little choice. If she wanted to end the Syndicate, she had to make this deal. I'll kill Vos, she said, her voice steady, but you'd better keep your end of the bargain. I'm not interested in games. Orlin chuckled softly, a sound that sent a chill down Mira's spine. Don't worry, my dear. I always keep my word. The Gorgona Nebula. Mira's ship, Raven's Claw, tore through the black void toward the Gorgona Nebula, a mysterious and dangerous area of space, filled with treacherous asteroid fields and nebula clouds that could swallow ships whole. This was not a place for the faint of heart, but Mira wasn't afraid. As she approached the nebula, a sense of foreboding gripped her. She knew that Vos wouldn't be easy prey. He had been running from Orlin for years, and Mira wasn't the first to be sent after him. She had to be faster, smarter, and more ruthless than those who had failed before her. Inside the nebula, Mira navigated the asteroid belt, her ship darting and weaving between massive rocks that seemed to appear out of nowhere. Her eyes never left the console. She knew that Vos's ship would be somewhere in this mess, hidden in the darkness. Finally, after what felt like hours, she saw it. A small, heavily modified freighter was drifting between the larger asteroids, trying to blend into the environment. Mira's heart raced. This was it. She wasn't going to let him escape. She engaged the tracking system on her ship and locked onto the target. The cloaking device on Vos's ship wasn't strong enough to fool the Raven's Claw. With a loud hum, Mira launched a missile directly at the freighter, tearing through the dark void. The truth behind the murder. The Gorgona Nebula was still fresh in Mira's mind. The hunt for Jurek Vos had been quick and decisive. Vos had barely had a chance to react before she took him down. He'd been no match for her ruthlessness. It hadn't been the challenge she'd hoped for, but the mission had been completed. But the real battle was still ahead. Admiral Vex Orlin had kept his word. His fleet was now at her disposal, and his soldiers, hardened and loyal, followed her command without hesitation. Yet, a dark knot tightened in Mira's chest. The bitterness of her actions weighed heavily on her, and with every step forward, her goal seemed further from reach. She had taken a life for Orlin, and now the Syndicate was going to feel her wrath. Still, the one question that tormented her remained. Why had Jonas been killed? She needed answers. Back in her command ship, the Raven's Claw, Mira sat alone in the cockpit, staring at the stars outside. Her eyes narrowed as she replayed the words of the smuggler she'd interrogated earlier. Lord Talos. That name kept haunting her. She didn't believe in coincidences. Everything pointed back to him. and she had a feeling that the syndicate's reach went deeper than she'd ever imagined. With Orland's fleet now under her control, it was time to push further into the heart of the syndicate's operations. Mira's next move took her to an old research station deep in the Crimson Expanse, a region of space that no one in their right mind would venture into. The station, Arctis 7, was long abandoned, but intelligence suggested it held data about the syndicate's covert operations, and possibly something about the weapon Jonas had uncovered. Jonas had been a brilliant engineer, and if anyone could have figured out the syndicate's plans, it was him. The hidden facility. The station was a ghost of its former self, its metal walls rusted and creaking under the pressure of time. Mira landed the Raven's Claw in the dark, decaying hangar, the whine of the landing gear cutting through the silence. The only sound she could hear was the slow, rhythmic hiss of the air vents as she made her way down the ship's ramp. The doors to Arctis 7 were sealed tight, but with a few clicks on her console, Mira hacked the system. The red lights flickered to life, casting long shadows on the walls. The station seemed to breathe with a haunting silence as she stepped into the empty corridors. The deeper she went into the facility, the more the feeling of dread washed over her. It wasn't just the silence. It was as if the very walls of the station were holding their breath. She could feel that something had been left behind here, something important. The mainframe room was at the far end of the station. As she reached the door, she found it locked tight, a security measure that even her skills couldn't bypass easily. Mira stood in front of the door for a moment, weighing her options. She didn't have time to waste. The syndicate could be tracking her every move. Without hesitation, she turned her attention to a nearby maintenance shaft and crawled inside. It was narrow, but it would take her around the back of the door. The shaft twisted and turned, making her skin crawl as she moved through the dark, cold metal. The smell of dust and old wiring lingered in the air. Minutes passed, but eventually she arrived at her destination. Mira dropped down into a small utility room, right next to the mainframe access. She silently approached the terminal, the soft hum of the station's systems, the only sound as she worked her way through the terminal security. A few moments later, she was in. The lights on the mainframe console flickered to life, and Mira immediately pulled up the files she'd come for. Data on the syndicate's operations flashed before her eyes. Outposts, manufacturing facilities, weapons cages, but it was one file in particular that caught her attention. Project Nebula. The title was enough to make her pause. Mira clicked on it. The document that unfolded before her eyes was nothing short of horrifying. It outlined a top-secret project the syndicate had been developing, a new weapon capable of destroying entire planets. But that wasn't the most shocking part. The weapon wasn't just built for mass destruction. It was designed to target specific populations, to wipe out entire cities or worlds, while leaving others untouched. In essence, it was a weapon of selective extermination. Jonas had stumbled upon this project. He'd discovered the plans, and he had been working to expose them. That was why the syndicate had killed him. His engineering mind had unlocked the secrets they'd tried so hard to keep hidden. And in his hands, he held the key to destroying them. But there was one more piece of the puzzle. At the bottom of the file was a set of coordinates. Coordinates that led to a hidden research facility, deep within syndicate-controlled space. Mira's blood ran cold. It was clear now. The syndicate's weapon had already been completed, and it was set to be deployed at any moment. The darkest truth. Mira felt her pulse quicken as she absorbed the full weight of the document. The weapon wasn't just a threat. It was a ticking time bomb, and it had been designed to kill millions. She closed her eyes, trying to steady her breath. She had to focus. She couldn't afford to lose herself in the flood of emotions rising within her. Her revenge, her grief, it had all led her to this moment. But as she turned to leave, something else caught her eye. A single encrypted file was hidden in the corner of the mainframe. Mira's curiosity got the best of her. She accessed it. The file contained a video, a grainy recording of a meeting between high-ranking syndicate members. including Lord Talos. Mira's heart stopped as the camera panned to a figure seated at the table. The face was partially obscured, but what she saw next sent a jolt of shock through her body. The figure's voice echoed through the speakers. "We can't let Jonas Kane's death go to waste. We need to use his wife." The recording cut off abruptly, but Mira was no longer looking at the screen. She was frozen, staring at the name that had appeared in the corner of the file. Mira Kane. Her hands trembled. The syndicate had known about her all along. They had been watching her, waiting for the perfect moment to use her. Her husband's death had been part of a plan all along, and she had just walked right into their trap. Rise of the Red Widow. Mira stood before the shattered remains of the Arctis 7 station, her breath steady as she watched the wreckage float in the void. The truth was out there now. The syndicate's plans, their weapon, and her husband's death. But there was something deeper buried beneath it all. A lie so dark that it had twisted everything she thought she knew about her life. The syndicate had been using her. She had been their target all along. And they had killed Jonas not just to silence him, but to force her hand into their game. Mira Kane, the former soldier, the loving wife, had been reduced to a pawn in their ruthless Cold War. Now, there was nothing left but the Red Widow. The name had come to her as a whisper, both a warning and a promise. As she left the wreckage of the station behind, the familiar words echoed in her mind. "They've made you into something else." She'd heard them spoken by one of Orlan's men when she'd first shown up at his base. The moment those words hit her ears, she realized that her vengeance had already become legend. But that was not enough. She had to carve out her own path. She had to become a nightmare. From that moment, Mira decided to take control of her destiny. The galaxy would never see her coming. The Red Widow would hunt them all down. The Red Widow's campaign. With Admiral Orlan's fleet at her disposal, Mira began a ruthless and unforgiving campaign against the syndicate. It wasn't just about destroying their outposts anymore. It wasn't just about killing their enforcers or generals. She was going after their heart, their core, and she would burn it all to the ground. The first step was the Obsidian Syndicate's supply lines, the arteries that kept the galaxy's largest crime organization alive. Mira targeted convoys carrying everything from weapons to raw materials. Each mission was precise. Her fleet would arrive in the dead of night, strike without warning, and then disappear before the syndicate could even react. She didn't leave survivors. Every soldier, every criminal, every piece of syndicate property was wiped off the map. Her reputation spread across the galaxy. Terror became her signature. Across systems, the syndicate began to realize something. Something deadly was hunting them. They weren't safe on their own planets, in their ships, or even in the remote corners of space. The Red Widow was coming for them all. The first face of the syndicate falls. Weeks into the campaign, Mira received intelligence from Orlan's network. She had already cleared out a dozen syndicate bases, but now there was something more critical in her sights. General Corin Vall, one of the syndicate's top strategists, had been leading the defense against her forces. His tactics had delayed her progress, and he was now positioned to block any further advancement. Mira couldn't afford to let him live. He had to be eliminated, quickly and decisively. The mission was set. The target, the Nebula Fortress, an orbital station surrounded by a massive asteroid field. It was the perfect location to make an example of the syndicate's strength, and Mira planned to do just that. She didn't bring the entire fleet. Instead, she took a single strike cruiser, cutting through the asteroid field herself. She relied on her speed, her precision, and her ability to remain unseen. General Vall had no idea what was coming for him. The fortress loomed ahead as the ship's systems blinked with a warning. A dozen enemy ships were patrolling the area. Mira's eyes narrowed. They would never expect her to slip past them. The Red Widow was more than a name. She was a shadow. With the skill of a predator, Mira maneuvered her ship into the asteroid field. It was narrow, dangerous, and barely visible through the thick dust clouds. Her cruiser slid through the gaps, evading detection. Her shields flickered under the strain, but she wasn't worried. This was a calculated risk. She was close, so close. Finally, she emerged on the other side of the station. A single shot from her ship's weapons disabled the station's defense turrets, and she cut her engines to glide silently toward the main docking bay. Her forces infiltrated the station before anyone could raise the alarm. Inside, it was chaos. Val's men were scrambling, but Mira was already on the move. She wasn't just here to kill them. She was here to send a message. Each room she entered was a scene of brutal efficiency. Every guard that crossed her path was silenced before they could draw a weapon. She moved like a phantom through the station's dark corridors, her eyes burning with a ruthless focus. Then she found him. General Val was in the command center, surrounded by his officers. They turned, but it was already too late. Mira had reached him. The last words Val spoke were a whispered curse, but Mira didn't flinch. She pulled the trigger, and the general's body fell to the floor. The message. The following day, the entire galaxy was alerted to the destruction of the Nebula Fortress. It wasn't just another syndicate loss. It was a symbol. Mira had left her mark. A holographic transmission broadcasted across every channel. The message was simple. The Red Widow is coming, and no one is safe. Across the galaxy, a ripple of fear spread. The Obsidian Syndicate had always been an unshakable empire, their reach stretching to the furthest corners of known space. But now, there was a new force, a new nightmare. It was one that couldn't be ignored. The Syndicate's carefully controlled territories were starting to crumble. Mira had sparked something inside the hearts of rebels, bounty hunters, and mercenaries alike. They weren't just afraid of the Red Widow. They feared what she would do next. The fall of the Syndicate. Weeks turned into months, and Mira's campaign continued. She moved through the galaxy like a storm, swift, silent, and devastating. Her strikes were calculated, each one more lethal than the last. She wasn't just killing, she was breaking their morale. Each loss to the Syndicate was a wound that would never heal. Mira's forces, bolstered by Orlan's mercenaries and a network of dissidents, grew stronger. They raided Syndicate strongholds, destroyed supply caches, and crippled their defenses. The Syndicate wasn't prepared for someone like her, someone willing to burn it all down to achieve their goal. Her reputation was growing beyond even the Syndicate's capacity to control. Lord Talos, the head of the Syndicate, could feel the walls closing in around him. His empire was crumbling, and the Red Widow was at the heart of it. But Mira wasn't done. She wanted more. She wanted Talos dead. She had been playing a long game, and now, with the Syndicate on its knees, she was preparing to deliver the final blow. The final battle. The stars stretched out in front of Mira like an endless sea, but for her, they held no comfort. Her mind was focused on one thing. Lord Talos. He had been the shadow behind the Syndicate's rise. He was the one who had orchestrated Jonas's death, the one who had planned for her destruction. And now, he was hiding in the heart of the Syndicate's last bastion. Duskspire, a massive fortress station nestled in the blackened abyss of the Vareth Nebula. Mira's fleet was ready. She had destroyed every other Syndicate stronghold, crippled their supply lines, and broken their spirit. But Duskspire was their home. It was where Lord Talos sat, surrounded by his most loyal enforcers, preparing to make his final stand. It was where Mira's vengeance would be realized. The time for subtlety had passed. No more strikes in the shadows, no more whispered threats. The Red Widow was done playing the game by their rules. This time, she would bring the fight to them. Her bloody campaign had already destroyed the Syndicate's inner circle. Now, with Orlan's fleet behind her and her unrelenting rage, Mira was going to tear Duskspire apart piece by piece. The descent into hell. As Mira's flagship, the Raven's Claw, emerged from the nebula's thick clouds, the enormity of Duskspire loomed ahead. It was a monstrous structure made of jagged metal and stone, covered in spikes and fortifications. It looked as though it was a piece of the very nebula, a grotesque twist of technology and rock fused together. Target is locked, Mira's tactical officer reported, her voice sharp with purpose. Shields are holding at 100%. We're ready for the assault. Mira nodded. Proceed as planned. No survivors. Around her, the fleet began to position itself, preparing for the assault. This wasn't just a space battle. It was the final confrontation, and every ship under her command had been chosen for its power, speed, and brutality. The initial volley of missiles and laser fire erupted into the air as the Red Widow's fleet began the attack. Waves of explosions rippled across the outer walls of Duskspire as the Syndicate's defense systems scrambled to react. But it was too late. Mira had already anticipated their response. She knew the Syndicate would try to defend every angle, so she struck from a blind spot, a weakness in the fortress's outer defenses that even the most sophisticated sensors couldn't detect. Her ships dove into the chaos, and Mira's heart pounded in her chest. She could feel the tension, the buildup of a storm ready to break. For the first time in months, she allowed herself to feel the familiar rush of battle, the joy of destruction. It was all coming down to this moment. Lord Talos would not escape. The battle inside Duskspire. The fortress was vast, with miles of corridors, docking bays, and armories scattered throughout its depths. Mira's forces descended through the outer defenses like a swarm of locusts, slaughtering anything in their path. But this wasn't just about brute force. It was a war of attrition, a psychological assault designed to crush the Syndicate's resolve. Mira led her squadron of elite mercenaries into the heart of Duskspire. The corridors twisted like the interior of a beast, but Mira moved through them with the precision of a hunter closing in on its prey. Her men followed, shadows in the dark, armed to the teeth, ready to neutralize whatever they encountered. Every turn brought her closer to Lord Talos. The murderous whispers of his enforcers filled the air as they scrambled to prepare for her attack. But it was too late. Mira had already penetrated their defenses. She stormed into the command center, where Talos's second-in-command, General Zoran, awaited with a dozen of his best soldiers. Zoran, a hulking figure clad in black battle armor, was ready. "So the Red Widow finally comes for the king," he snarled, drawing his massive energy blade. Mira didn't hesitate. The battle was brutal, with gunfire and explosive charges filling the air. But Mira's fury was unmatched. She sliced through her enemies with the speed and precision of a master, each movement executed like a dance of death. General Zoran fell first, his body collapsing in a heap as Mira plunged her blade into his chest. The rest of the Syndicate's men tried to retaliate, but they were no match for her. Mira had become a weapon, forged by pain and rage. One by one, they fell. Her men surged forward, clearing the way as they moved deeper into the fortress. The confrontation with Talos. At last, Mira reached the heart of Duskspire, the throne room of Lord Talos. The doors opened with a slow, ominous creak. There, seated in the center of the room, sat Talos, the mastermind behind it all. His pale, emotionless face was framed by dark, sharp features, and his eyes gleamed with the cold intelligence of a man who had never been afraid of anything. "You've come far, Red Widow," Talos said, his voice calm, as though he were speaking to an old acquaintance. "But you should know, it's all been for nothing. Your husband was never supposed to stop us. You were the one I wanted. You were the key." Mira stepped forward, her voice low and steady. "You killed him because you feared me. But you're wrong. You're not the one in control anymore." Talos chuckled softly, his smile twisted. "You think your little war has mattered. The Syndicate has always been unstoppable. The galaxy will always need us, even after you kill me. You're wrong. The galaxy will remember you, Talos," Mira said, raising her blade. "But it won't be for what you built. It will be for your end." The fight that ensued was savage and brutal. Talos was a skilled fighter, using his augmented strength and speed to his advantage. But Mira was driven by something far more powerful than just combat training. She was driven by revenge, and by the love she had for Jonas. With each strike, she poured her grief into the battle. After a long, grueling fight, Mira finally landed the killing blow. Talos' body fell to the floor with a sickening thud. His reign of terror had ended. The Syndicate falls. With Talos' death, the Syndicate collapsed like a house of cards. The remaining leaders were either killed or scattered, and their operations ceased almost overnight. The galaxy was left to deal with the aftermath of the Red Widow's campaign. Mira stood in the wreckage of Duskspire, breathing heavily as she stared at the now lifeless body of Lord Talos. Her vengeance had been achieved. But the galaxy, her enemies, and the people who had followed her had all witnessed something else. They had witnessed the fall of an empire, a symbol of corruption, greed, and destruction, and the rise of something new. The Red Widow's name would live on, not as a killer, but as a legend, a woman who had turned her grief into a fury that could not be stopped. Justice or revenge. The dust had barely settled on the ruins of Duskspire when Mira stood at the edge of the shattered window, looking out into the abyss of space. The Obsidian Syndicate had been destroyed. Lord Talos was dead. The galaxy had been freed from the grip of the Syndicate's corruption. The people who had once lived in fear now had a chance to rebuild. But Mira wasn't sure she could feel any peace. The Red Widow had done her job. She had torn down an empire, but in doing so, she had become something else, something unrecognizable. For so long, she had been driven by vengeance, the need to avenge Jonas, to make the Syndicate pay for the death of the man she loved. But as she stared out into the void, Mira could no longer separate the woman she had been from the monster she had become. The lines had blurred. A soft chime from her communication console interrupted her thoughts. It was a message from Admiral Vex Orlin, her once dangerous ally. Mira. His voice crackled through the static. It's time. The words hung in the air like a weight. She had been expecting this call. Orlin had always been clear that once the war was over, there would be no more alliances. He would want control of the territories they had won, the power they had gained. He had already begun consolidating resources, forming new alliances with those who had once feared the Syndicate. But Mira wasn't interested in becoming part of Orlin's new empire. She had already seen where his thirst for power led. He had betrayed others before. She would not let herself be another piece in his game. She wasn't a tool to be used. Her mind was made up. She stood, her heart heavy, and activated the communications console. Orlin, she said, her voice calm but with an edge of finality. I've done my part. The Syndicate is finished. I'm done with your wars. For a long moment, there was silence. When Orlin's voice finally returned, it was tinged with something darker, something she hadn't heard before. Disappointment. You've proven yourself, Mira. You were the one who could bring them down. But now you want to walk away, as if everything will be fine. You've done the hard work, but you can't just leave it all behind. You know what happens when power is left unchecked. You could be more than just a shadow. You could be a ruler. Mira's mind flashed to Jonas. He had wanted peace. He had dreamed of a future where they could be together, away from the fighting. That dream had died with him, and the universe, like Orlin, would never stop demanding more. She took a breath and spoke slowly. I'm not a ruler. I'm not a queen. I was a soldier, and I've done what I set out to do. But now, the galaxy needs something different. Not more bloodshed, not more power struggles. They need justice, not revenge. A choice of legacy. Orlin's response was cold. Then you'll die alone, Red Widow. You'll be forgotten like all the others who think they can make a difference without holding on to power. The galaxy never forgives those who let go of control. Mira shook her head. She had heard his words before. From others, from soldiers who had been corrupted by power, from generals who had let their ambition consume them. She wouldn't follow that path. She couldn't. After cutting the connection, Mira stood still for a moment. The war was over, but the journey had left her scared. Her actions had created a legend, a figure feared by the galaxy, but she hadn't done it for fame or power. She had done it for justice. Or had it been for revenge? Was there any difference anymore? Her thoughts were interrupted when one of her remaining officers, Lieutenant Myra Tellis, entered the room. She was a young officer, loyal to Mira from the beginning. Her expression was grim but respectful. "Mira," Tallis began, "the people are celebrating. The Syndicate's influence is crumbling across the galaxy. But the question still stands. What comes next?" Mira sighed, turning away from the window. "What comes next is not mine to decide," she replied. "The people will rebuild. I'm not their ruler, and I'm not their savior. I've already done enough." Tallis was silent for a moment, then spoke carefully. "The galaxy will remember you, Mira. They'll remember the Red Widow. You could be their leader if you wanted. You've already freed them from the Syndicate's grip. You could unite the fractured factions, create something new." Mira closed her eyes. The offer was tempting. The power, the control, everything she had destroyed, everything she had killed for. It could all be hers. She could command fleets, shape the future, and dictate the terms of the peace she had fought for. But the price of that power was too high. She had already walked too far down the path of vengeance. She wasn't willing to go any further. "No," Mira said quietly. "The Red Widow's time is over. I'll fade into the shadows like the ghost I've become. Let others shape the future. I've had enough blood on my hands." A new dawn. In the days that followed, the galaxy slowly began to change. The remnants of the Obsidian Syndicate were wiped out completely. New leaders, born from the ashes of the old empire, began to form coalitions to bring peace to the galaxy. New alliances formed, and reconstruction efforts began on the shattered planets. For the first time in years, people dared to believe in a future without the shadow of the Syndicate looming over them. And Mira, she disappeared. She left the Raven's Claw behind and went into hiding, her identity as the Red Widow becoming nothing but a whispered memory. She moved from one corner of the galaxy to the next, living among the people she had once fought to protect, seeing the world through different eyes. Though she had won her revenge, Mira had found no comfort in it. There were no celebrations, no grand victories. There was only the empty void left in her heart, a void that could never be filled. The galaxy was no longer a battlefield, but a fragile new world, waiting to be built. Mira had learned the hard way that vengeance could never heal a soul. She had fought for justice, but in the process, she had lost herself. And now, with the galaxy free from the Syndicate's grip, Mira began the long road toward redemption. Not for the people, but for herself. The legend of the Red Widow would fade, but the story of the woman behind it, the woman who had fought, loved, and lost, would never be forgotten.